Hello everyone, this is Shonko and welcome to chapter 9 of the Spring tutorial for beginners. So in the previous chapter we saw how we can create a REST API using Spring, and uh, we created a get method for our REST API. So in this chapter we're going to see how we can create a post method for a REST API. And for the demo I've already created this project, REST API demo. And these are the dependencies that we have for our project. So we have Spring Boot Starter Web, so that is going to make our application or web application, and it's going to help us build REST APIs. So that is a Spring support for web that we have added. And then we have Spring Boot Dev Tool, so every time we make a save, that's going to restart our server and get the changes reflected. And then we have Spring Boot Starter Test, so that is for testing of our application. And then we have Spring Boot Starter Actuator, so that is going to add some basic metrics, health metrics to our application, and it is going to expose some endpoint for checking the health of our application. And then we have this OJDBC7 dependency, which is help us connect to the database. So we'll be using an Oracle database as a backend. So this dependency is going to help us connect to the database from our application. And then we have Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, so that is going to help us build the persistence layer for our application, right? So that's all we have for the dependencies, and let's take a look at the classes that we have. So first up we have this user service application class. So this is going to be the entry point for our application, or this is going to be the entry point for our it's going to be the entry point for our application, right? And we have this main method here, which has this Spring application.run method inside it. So that is going to set up the application context and do a lot of stuff for us behind the scenes. So that's the magic of Spring Boot, right? And then we have the Spring Boot application annotation on top of this class. So this is going to make this application a Spring Boot application, right? So that's for this class. And then we have this controller class. So inside the controller, so if we remember our architecture for the Spring MVC, or the MVC architecture that we have. So first a request comes and hits the dispatcher servlet, and from the dispatcher servlet we go to the handler mapping, and from the handler mapping it goes to the controller, and from the controller it goes to the view resolver to check if there's a view associated with the request. And if there's a view associated with the request, it then renders that view to the user, right, as the response for the request, right? So this is our controller class, and inside this we have this annotation right at the beginning, controller. So that would specify this Spring to treat this class as a controller. So controller is gonna handle the requests that come in to our application, and then we have the request mapping here. So this for some endpoint or for some URL that has this thing /API/v1 is gonna come to this controller, user controller, right? And then we have the service layer auto-wired here or injected into this class or into this component. And then we also have a validator injected into this component, right? So we'll talk about each of these in details, but let's first take a look at the methods that we have inside this class. So we have the save user method, and this has an annotation post mapping on top of it, and we have the path as /save. So this is going to be the endpoint for saving or for invoking this method save user. So every time this endpoint is hit by the user, or every time we get a request with this endpoint /save, this is going the request is going to come to this method, right? It's gonna come to this request handler, right? And then we have this @valid annotation here, and then we have request body. So this is gonna serve as the request body for our API. So this is gonna be a post request because we have this post mapping annotated on top of this method, and then @valid is gonna validate the request body that we would be getting as a user, right? So let's take a look at the user class. So I'll go inside model package and I'll open up user. So this is basically the entity class that we have for our application, or this is the table representation, or this is the object representation of the database table that we have at our backend, right? So if we take a look at our database, we have this table called profile users, right? And if we hit this select start from profile users, we get these records inside our table, right? So we have these records inside our table, and the table has these columns: username, password, first name, and last name, right? And if we go back to our Java class, this class has exactly the same attributes inside of the class. So we have username, password, first name, and last name, right? And this class is annotated as @entity, and we have @table, and the name is profile user. So this object or this class is going to be mapped to a backend table, which is essentially the profile users table, or the profile user table that we have here inside our Oracle database, right? So we have these annotations @ID. So this is going to serve as the ID, or this is going to serve as the primary key for our database or for our object, right? Username is going to be the primary key inside of our database, and then this is mapped to this column. So with the help of this annotation column, we are saying that this attribute username is mapped to a backend column, a backend table, or a column of a backend table, which is named as username, right? And this is some validation that we have put here. So we have said not null, and so that means that this field cannot be null. The username field cannot be null, right? So when we are getting a request to our API, this field should not be null. So that is what validate @valid annotation is going to check, right? And if it is null, we're going to throw out this message: username cannot be null, right? So we have this message here inside not null not null annotation. And for the other attributes as well, we have similar kind of stuff. So we have column as password for password, and then not null, and messages password cannot be null for password field. And then for first name and last name, we don't have validation here. So we do have validation for one of our endpoints for first name and last name, and we're going to see that in some time. But here we don't have any validation, right? So for these two fields we don't have validation, and for the first two fields we have validation set inside the entity class, right? So let's go back to our controller, and this method is supposed to serve this endpoint at /save, right? And inside this method we are expecting the user record as a request body for our post request, right? And let's take a look at this response class that we have here. So this is a custom class that I've created. So all our responses are going to be of the same type, or are going to look like looks the same, right? So each response is going to have a data field and an error field, right? And for error we have a custom error class that we have created, and inside the error class we have error code, which is essentially a string, and the reason for the error, right? That is also a string. And this response class takes in a type parameter. So the type parameter is going to be the type of data that we're trying to send as the response, right? So let's go back to the user controller class. So here we have a bit of validation going on. So if so let's take a look at this validator class, or the interface that we have, right? So that is inside util, and this validator is essentially an interface which takes in a type parameter, and this has an abstract method called isValid, which again takes in an input which is of the type parameter that we are passing in here, and basically this method is supposed to validate uh, validate the request, right? Or whatever we pass in, this is basically going to validate the input parameter that comes in, right? And we have this user validator, which is again a component. So string is going to create a bean for this class at the time of when the application context is loaded, right? And this class implements a validator interface, and we have passed in the type as user, and we have this is valid overridden method. So inside this we are checking if the first name and the last name or if the first name or the last name is empty or is null. If they are empty or if they are null, then we are sending a false, or and if they're not null or if they're not empty, then we are sending a true, right? So we could have also done this inside the user class. We could have also, you know, set this annotation @not null for these two fields inside the user class, but I didn't do that intentionally because we'd be using the same user component, or we'd be using the same user class for two different endpoints, right? So for save, we'd be using the user class as an input parameter, and for fetch, we'd also be using the user class as an input parameter, right? And when we are trying to fetch a user from the database, we'd just be sending in the username and the password. We won't be sending in other details such as first name, last name, right? So for the fetch endpoint, the first name and last name are not mandatory, right? But for creating a user or for saving a user in the database, we need to send in all the parameters or all the fields, right, for user class. So that is why we have not provided the validation inside the entity class, and we are validating using a validator component that we have created, right? And if user is not valid, what we are doing, we are throwing a missing data exception, right? So that is a custom exception class that I've created, and let's take a look at that class. So this is basically the class, and it extends runtime exception, right? And we have this get message method overridden, and we are sending a message, and then we are appending a space, and then we are appending the message from the super class, right? And then we are sending or we are returning the complete string, right? And apart from that, we have this user save. So that is again going to the service layer, and we'll take a look at the service layer in a while. So let's just understand here that we're going to the service layer, and we're trying to save the user. If the user is a valid, if the request is a valid request, then we are trying to save the user into the database using the service layer, which is injected again into this component. So we have this service layer auto wired or injected into the controller component, right, using the save user method. And then we are setting the response data. So the response is again a custom class that I've created, which takes in the parameter, which takes in a type parameter, right? And the data that it emits or the data that it generates is of the type parameter that we are sending in, right? So here we are sending in a string type, and so the data we are setting in is a string type, right? User has been successfully registered, and then we are returning a response entity. So this response entity is provided by Spring, the Spring class or the Spring framework, and we are making use of it, and we are sending in the response, and then we are setting the status as created. So this means that a new user is created in the database, right? And then we have this fetch endpoint. So our URL would look something like this. It would start with /API/v1, and these are the endpoints that we have here. So we have one /save, that is going to save an entity, or that is going to save a user into the database, and then we have /fetch, that is going to fetch a user from the database, the details of a user from the database, provided that the username and the password are correct, right, or match with one of the records inside the database, right? And then this method generates a response type. But response, if we take a look at response class, it takes in a type parameter, but we haven't mentioned a type parameter here. And the reason is, if the user is a valid, if the password and if the username are valid, and if it is a valid user at the database, then we are returning a response which is of the type user. And if the response is not or if the request is not valid, if the username or if the credentials are not correct, then we are passing in a response which is of type string, and we are setting this message, no user found for the given credentials, right? So that is the reason we have taken this generic or raw type response here, right? And we are annotating this method with the rest of press warnings raw type, right? And apart from this, we have the service layer. So let's take a look at the service layer now. So we have this repository, which is a DAO layer, DAO layer, that is auto-wired, or that is injected into this component, the service component, right? And we have these methods: find user by username, save user, and delete user, delete all user, and other stuff, right? So if we take a look at our repository component, which is inside the DAO layer, we just have this method, find by username. But if we go to our service class, we can see we have different methods other than the one that we just saw, find by username, right? We have save, we have delete also. These methods are provided by the JPA repository that we are using here. So this is an interface. The repository is essentially an interface that extends JPA repository, and here we are passing in the type of the entity, that is user, and the type of the primary key. So the type of the primary key is string, right? And we have defined this method, which is called a query method, and the implementation for this is going to be provided by Spring. We do not have an implementation written by us, so we're going to learn about that in our later chapters about Spring Data JPA and about the DAO support that Spring provides in its data module. So that's going to be a different chapter. For the timing, we just understand that this method is called a query method, and the implementation for this is going to be provided by Spring at runtime, and we need not write an implementation for this interface, right? So we haven't written a concrete class which extends or which implements this interface, right? So that is basically it for the code. Okay, so there's one more component that we would want to take a look at. So if this user is not valid, here we throw a missing exception, data exception, right? And we have this some mandatory data for the user is missing, please verify, and we submit message being sent from here, right? And there's one more component inside this application. We have this central exception handler component, right? So what this is going to do is whenever an exception is going to be thrown by the application, or whenever an exception is thrown by the application, it would be intercepted by this class. So we have this controller advice annotation on top of this class, right? So this is going to intercept all exceptions that are thrown by this application, right? And we have these annotations at the red exception handler on top of these methods, right? And inside each of them we have a type of class mentioned. So inside this we have this missing data exception dot class mentioned, and inside this we have method argument not valid exception class, right? Now from here we are throwing missing data exception, right? So whenever a controller throws an exception, it would be intercepted by the class which has at the red controller advice annotated on top of it, right? And we have these methods, exception handler method. So based on the type of exception that is thrown, so we have missing data exception being thrown from here, right? It would go into that particular exception handler method which has that type or that class mentioned inside exception handler. So if you're throwing a missing data exception from any controller inside our application, it would be intercepted by this class and it would go inside this method handle missing data exception, right? So here we are setting the response and we are setting the error code as 400, which is essentially a bad request, and then we are setting some error for the response, and then we are setting the response entity and setting the response code, right, as bad request. Similarly for method argument not valid, we are setting some kind of error response. So this is basically done because we want all our responses, be it a success response or be it an error response, to be of the same type or to look the same, right? To look like the response structure that we have created here inside the response class, right? So it is supposed to have a data part and it is supposed to have an error part, right? So if it is a success response, if our API is spitting out some success response, it is supposed to populate the data part, and the error part is supposed to be null. And if we are throwing some exception, or if we are throwing some error from our application, it is supposed to populate the error part, right? And the data part is supposed to be null, or it is supposed to contain some relevant message, right? So now let's start up the application and see how it works. So I'm gonna say run as Spring Boot app, and this is going to run on 8283 port, right? So we would just set up a request structure in Postman. So I'll be using Postman to test our REST API, right? And we have the setup here, localhost 8283, so that is a port on which our application is running, or on which our API is running. And we have this, and we have this endpoint here /API/v1. So that is exactly what we have mentioned inside the request mapping on top of our controller, right? And inside the post mapping we have this at the /save and /fetch endpoints, right? So we're gonna hit the fetch endpoint first, and let's take a look at the records that we have inside our database. So we have 3 records inside our database, and we're going to use one of them to fetch the records for a user. So I'm going to use the test12 username, and I'll say password as, say, what do we have the password for test12? It's pwd123, right? So I'm just going to copy this and paste here, and by this time our application should be running. Yeah, it's up and running, and it's running on Tomcat, the embedded the embedded server that we have inside our application. So in a previous chapter we had seen that if we add the dependency for Spring Web into our application, it embeds a runtime server, which is essentially a Tomcat server, into our application. So we need not deploy our application on any external server. We rather have an embedded server inside of our application, and this is running on port 8283, which can be found here, right? So let's try to run our API and click on send. So we have our response here. So for username test12 and password pwd123, we have the first name and last name as xyz and abc, right? Now let's go to our database and see. Okay, so this is the one that we have used, test12 and pwd123. So the first name is xyz and last name is abc, right? Now let's try another user. So I'm gonna take this one, test_user2, and the password is same for this user. I'm gonna say test_2 and click on send. So we have our record, or we have our user here fetched from the database, and we have the first name as test1 and last name as last one, right? Now let's try to create a user. So I'm gonna say save instead of fetch. I'm gonna say save, right? And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send this. So this is an invalid request that I'm trying to send in for the save endpoint, right? Because for if you're clicking, or if you're trying to hit the save endpoint, that means we are trying to enter a user into our database, or we are trying to save a user into our database, and this is not the complete information for our user, right? A user has to have a first name and a last name that has to be sent in, right, along with the request. But we have partial data being sent in here in a request. So let's just try to send this and see what happens and how the application behaves. So we can see we have a 400 bad request, right? And here we have the same structure that we had for our success response, but this time it is an error response, and inside the data component, or inside the data part or of our request or of our response, we have this message: some of the mandatory fields are missing, please verify and resubmit. And inside the error part, we have error code as 400, and reason is mandatory fields missing, right? Now let's try to pass in a correct request. So I'm gonna say first name is gonna be, right, I need to change the password, I need to change the username. So I'll say test user 21, and first name is gonna be QWERTY, and last name is gonna be I would say QIOP, right? And let's click on send. So this is a correct request that we have sent in inside our API, and this should save the user into our database, right? So we have the message here 201 created, and the error is null. So this is a success message, and we have the data as user has been successfully registered. Now let's go back to our database and run this query again and see if we have our user registered inside our database or not. So we can see we have our new user created inside our database, right? This is the one we just created, and we have this record inside our database. So let's try to run this again. Let's try to run this application again, and and let's try to hit the fetch endpoint, and let's just try to pass the username instead of the username and the password. So this is supposed to be an incorrect request for our API, right? And let's click on send and see how this works. So we have this message: data, some of the mandatory fields are missing, please verify and resubmit. And inside the error part of our request, we have the error code as 400 and the reason as mandatory fields missing, right? So be it a success response or be it an error response, we have the same structure that is being followed, and in most organizations this is a standard that is followed. So there's the standard request, or there's the standard response pattern that we need to follow for all our APIs, and that we need to follow for all of our responses, be it a successful response or be it an error response. So that is how we can use controller advice to centralize our exception handling inside of our application, and we can just create these exception handler methods where we can write our own logic of how to handle the request or how to handle the exception, and what kind of error response or what kind of response we want to throw out of our API when we get a response or when we get an exception. And that is basically it for this chapter. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the Spring AOP module. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video, and thanks for watching.